So I just finished a book called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And it's by a historian named Kristin Dumez. As usual, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but this was a pretty good book. It's hard to describe it really because there was so much, and this author goes through a lot in American history, really from the time of World War II until now, and a lot of political things that I, haven't been aware of, even just as a student of history, a lot of details that I'm just unfamiliar with. But first of all, the book is really, and I wasn't really aware of this going into it and starting to read it, but this book is about essentially what you could call toxic masculinity. I don't believe she uses this term in the text, from what I can remember, but that's basically what it's about, specifically as it relates to kind of the conservative Christian culture and how recent politics has been very influenced by this whole issue of masculinity. And so from the outset, the purpose of the author is to kind of show how it is that Donald Trump can be kind of venerated by the Christian community for being the type of person that he is, and the controversy that has been so prevalent in our specifically within Christian community over this individual as an icon for the faith. And so this is what the author is doing, is trying to describe how it is that we got to this point. What are the factors that contributed to our history that allowed it to get to a point where Christians are taking this person as kind of their poster boy for what they believe, at least in terms of politics. So she goes through, beginning with John Wayne, and so that's why the book is called Jesus and John Wayne. And this is something that I had no idea about, had never heard of this before. But John Wayne, apparently in his time, was known as the icon of masculinity. And he was, as this author describes him, very conservative in his activism outside of his acting. And of course, his films were influenced by this sort of masculinity that he and others in his sphere were proponents of. And this essentially, as Dumez describes, becomes the basis for so much of what we in modern sort of evangelical Christian culture consider to be masculine. And the reason it's called toxic now is because of the way that it is really very white-centric. It's largely sexist, and these are, these sorts of things have been carried through. And she talks about how, John Wayne is maybe the basis of it, but then she talks about what happens as a result and response to different wars. Certain individuals like, Ronald Reagan and Jerry Falwell and James Dobson, and all the way through, various presidents. And the interesting thing, and there's so much here that I can't really describe it very well. I think it requires reading this book to understand how all these pieces are fitting together to build up to what we have now. But what was interesting to me is the fact that this idea of violence being sort of a central aspect of masculinity is really a consistent theme throughout history, even from the time of Teddy Roosevelt, as this author discusses. And so, you carry that through a variety of American wars, and it just, it bleeds into the culture in various different ways. But the interesting part about it is how Christians latched onto it. And this is specifically, for the most part, talking about the evangelical response to this sort of idea of what masculinity is. And it's just so interesting that Christians, white evangelical Christians in particular, really just grasped onto this, and it's been pretty steady for a very long time that, they will justify violence for a variety of reasons, and almost kind of have the motto that the end justifies the means, right? And so you can kind of see that in various different ways. And that's, how you get to somebody like Donald Trump, where a lot of Christians will kind of ignore the things that he's said and done, because it gets them what they want, essentially. And so that's a major point of the book here. And so, there are a lot of ways that this builds up through the political system, but near the very end of the book, there are a few chapters where, she starts talking about all of the ways that this has affected evangelical Christian community. And you've got guys like Mark Driscoll, who, there was a whole podcast series on kind of the corruption that occurred in his church, with him as a leader. And so it's that sort of thing that leads into somebody like Donald Trump becoming president. And yeah, it's just very it's very interesting. It's very striking just to kind of see how this really doesn't begin with Donald Trump. It begins long before this, and he just is sort of the new iteration of the type of person that people, specifically white evangelicals, tend to see as kind of their poster boy again. Now, in terms of what I would rate the book, I would probably give it maybe a 7 or an 8, largely because of the way it's formatted. So it's not very systematically structured. As the chapters vaguely follow sort of a chronological timeline, so she's generally moving through history. She bounces back and forth a little bit, for the sake of different topics. But other than that, there wasn't like a clear structure of what the sort of purpose was for each chapter. It almost feels like the whole book is just one long discussion about what happens in, what has happened in our culture and these different movements that have occurred, just as sort of a response to this idea of masculinity. So anyway, yeah, and that's one major part about it is the book is about this, essentially the idea of toxic masculinity, even though, it doesn't necessarily seem like that just from reading the title. But I think it is a very valid and relevant conversation. And she really does kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of just how things seem, especially, for people like me who are sort of coming from evangelical community and have largely recently kind of looked at it from the outside in certain ways and noticed just all of the toxicity. I think she kind of makes a helpful point that this is a major aspect of that. This way that we've viewed masculinity, it has been sort of like the cornerstone of a lot of the issues that have resulted, that have been a part of the evangelical community recently. So for that, I would say, yeah, it's a great book to read. And I think a lot of evangelicals should read this book. And, they'd probably not like it, but, at least it's, it helps get somewhat of a perspective on what's going on here. So yeah, definitely a book that a person needs to read for themselves. There's a lot of details lacking in a review like this one, but yeah, good book, important read, really insightful and helpful for our current moment.